we should be live everywhere. I'm just checking a couple things to make sure that we are where we're supposed to be. And as soon as I verify that, we will get started. If you got your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn with us to Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7 is going to be where we're going to start this afternoon. Last week we finished Exodus 6, and Exodus 7 sort of picks up the story from Exodus 6. You remember Exodus 6 spoke of Exodus 6 ended with Moses asking God, or telling God, I'm not a good enough spokesman. I'm not a good enough speaker. Why are you sending me out? Why are you doing this? Why did you send me in the first place? Remember, he did that because the Israelites themselves had lost hope. They had all turned against God and didn't think that God would be able to do what he had promised to do. And so that's what we're going to pick up with, let's say in chapter 7, because in chapter 7, we're going to see what happens we're going to see what happens with God's response to Moses. Now, you remember chapter 6 we talked about was an interesting chapter because in the middle of that chapter it had a break. Moses and Aaron and God had come to them and told them that what they did the first time, they did what God had called them to do, but it did its purpose, but it wasn't the end. We talked about how everyone was discouraged. Then we get picked back up in the end of 6 after the lineage and the telling about the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. We saw Moses again telling God that he wasn't a good spokesman. He wasn't a very good speaker. Therefore, like I said, for God to send somebody else. And this is what we're going to see in Exodus 7, who God descends to send and what he tells Moses. And again, you know the story, he sends Moses, but he reminds Moses of what he has done. So we started in verse 1 of chapter 7. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. Now, let's stop right there and let's talk about these verses. Notice first, God responds back to Moses. In chapter 6, I told you 2 other times already that Moses said, God, send somebody else. I'm not a good speaker. God reminds him of his role. Notice, God says, I have made you like God to Pharaoh. He gives that role of a prophet from a God to people. That Moses is like God to Pharaoh, in that Pharaoh is the one receiving the message comes from God, and the way to get the message from God to Pharaoh is through Aaron. And he says here, Aaron shall be your prophet. And the idea, that's how God worked through the prophets, was God was the source. He gave that message to another man, and that man delivered that message to the people. And so God reminds him, I made you like God to Pharaoh. He says, I've already put you in this spot. And that's another thing God's telling him. I've already put you in this spot that you're going to be like God to Pharaoh. You're the one who went to Pharaoh and you did what I told you to do. And now you've got to follow up with it. We're going to show Pharaoh what he has done. And he knows, he says, you shall speak all that I command you. And again, your brother shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. You're going to go and tell him again to let my people go, let them be free. But then verse 3, God again reminds them that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, again, this idea of hardening Pharaoh's heart doesn't mean that Pharaoh doesn't have a choice, doesn't mean that God makes him his stooge or makes him his lackey. What this basically means is that God allowed Pharaoh to have this hard heart. God allowed the circumstances to be there that allowed Pharaoh not to change his mind. And what happens is we see many times in this encounter, we're going to see it from here forward, that there are times that we're told that the Bible says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So what we see here is God's not putting ideas in Pharaoh's mind that are not there. God's not forcing Pharaoh to hold this people on strong when if Pharaoh had his own choice, he'd let the people go. No, God is giving him a choice, but God knows what choice Pharaoh is going to make. And so God is saying he's not going to force Pharaoh to let the people go, but instead he's going to show Pharaoh who he is. And he knows, he said, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the lands of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Here up to this point, Moses and Aaron have only went to Pharaoh with words. They've not yet went with miracles. Remember, he gave them 3 miracles to do to prove to the children of Israel who he was, but he has not said go to Pharaoh with these miracles yet. Now we're going to see that change. God says, I'm going to do my signs and my wonders. I'm going to do my signs to prove who I am, to prove what I can do. And he says, even though I do that, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Pharaoh's not going to listen. He says, therefore, I will lay my hand upon the hand of Egypt, and I will bring my hosts. Now, it's very interesting how God describes the people of Israel first as hosts. The idea of hosts there is an idea of an army. God says, I'll bring my armies out of the land of Egypt. So God is describing Israel as what is going to become when it goes into Canaan, an army. But God here describes these slaves as hosts. He said, I'm going to bring my multitude out of Egypt. The children of the people, the children of Israel are going to come out. And he said, I'm going to do it by great acts of judgment. He's going to judge Pharaoh. And he's judged Pharaoh. That's why God has that. This is allowed to happen, because Pharaoh has hardened his heart. The Egyptians have turned away from God. They have shown their allegiance to these pagan gods. And God's going to demonstrate his power as the true almighty God, just as he will in other places. And he says here, now notice what he says, these plagues that we're about to get into are called signs, wonders, his mighty hand, or his laying his hand on the people, and his acts of judgment. But God goes on in verse 5 to continue talking about this. He says, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So you notice what happens here. God says the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And the idea of know here is not they're just going to know my name. They're going to know about me. They're going to recognize my power. They're going to acknowledge who I am. They're going to acknowledge that a greater power, a greater God has went against this land of Egypt, went against its gods, and has come out victorious, and it has delivered his people from among them. And when God gives Moses and Aaron this speech, this idea of stay strong, stay firm, this is what I'm going to do. Notice Moses and Aaron did exactly as God told them to do. They followed God's command. And we're going to see that in many times throughout these next few books. The emphasis about following God's command, of how precise it was that they obeyed God's word and they followed it to the T. And then we get in verse 7 a parenthetical note. What's called a parenthetical note, meaning it's just an aside to let us know some facts. So let's get an idea. This is done in the Pentateuch. It's also done in Genesis. It's part of the Pentateuch that Moses will do this. So let us know the timeline of when this is happening. And here we see in verse 7 that Moses is 80 years old when this happens, and Aaron is 83. And this has always been an interesting thing to think of as I've studied this story and truly thought about it and realized that the age of Moses and Aaron, think about that. Some of you watching today are 80 years old or getting close to 80. Can you imagine being 80 in our time, in our mindset, getting 80, you're ready to retire, you're ready to settle, be settled, you're ready to quit work, and God calls you to go and lead a people. God calls you to go to the leader of a nation and stand before him and tell him to let your people go. God uses Moses and Aaron in their old age, in their ages of wisdom, some people have said. It's very interesting that this idea that, again, Moses and Aaron are at an age when most people would think of being done, winding things down, but yet they're winding things up. They're just getting started. So verse 8, we continue this story to see what happens. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle. Then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, and it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So what happens first here is God goes to Moses and Aaron again and says, go to Pharaoh. And when you go to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's going to say, prove yourselves by working a miracle. Prove yourself with a sign is the idea here. And again, remember the idea of signs is that signs are done to prove who you're authorized by, to prove that you are sent from a higher power, to prove that you've got something behind you. And so Moses is then told to tell Aaron, this is what you're going to do. Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh. Now, it's interesting. This staff is the same staff that Moses had earlier in the wilderness. This is that same staff that's going to be gone. And this staff is referred to in 2 or 3 different ways. It's referred to as the staff of Moses, the staff of Aaron, and also the staff of God. And it appears that whoever is taking the lead has this staff, and the same staff is what's doing all these miracles, and the same staff that's later put into the ark. But he tells Aaron, take your staff and throw it down on the ground. You're going to throw it on the ground and it become a serpent. Now, what's interesting about the word serpent here is the word serpent here is a different word than what was used in chapter 4. You remember in chapter 4, God told Moses to throw his staff down, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it, and Moses had to grab it by the tail, and it became a staff again. Here, the word is a more unusual word for serpent. It can mean very large lizard. Some have said that it may even actually could mean crocodile or a large snake. And so the idea here, either way, no matter what it is, technically whatever this word is, the idea is that it's going to be large. It's going to be big. It's going to be different. And Moses says you're going to do that, and it's going to become this type of serpent. And they go in, and again, notice the repetition here that they went into Pharaoh and did as the Lord commanded. How important it is to notice they're doing what God commanded them to do. And he knows that Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. It became this large lizard. And then we see the next verse that Pharaoh and his wise men come in. Now, it's interesting about Pharaoh's wise men and sorcerers, the magicians, because we don't know how they do this. Some have wondered if they may have had some power granted by Satan. Again, that may be a stretch, but we've seen Satan have power at certain times, such as the demon possession during the time of Christ. That could be it. Or some have said this is simply that the magicians do what magicians did today. They have a honed craft. They have a show they put on. And these magicians, and some people think that it very well possibly could be, that these magicians were very well likely doing these kind of stunts anyway. Meaning that for the staff to become a serpent was not an unusual thing to see by these magicians. God is using something what we would call in their wheelhouse that they have used before, and they know how to perform to prove a point. But no matter how we figure this out, these magicians are able to copy God's miracle. They're able to copy this serpent. However, we again see the idea about the difference in the serpents is that these magicians throw their staff down, they become a serpent. But what happens next is that Aaron's staff swallows up the others. Aaron's staff is shown to be superior, and that's the idea here. And it also shows us that Aaron's staff was the real thing. Meaning that these others probably may have appeared to be serpents. Again, magicians, they did sleight of hand or some kind of trick like that. They appeared to be a serpent, but wasn't a serpent. And again, surely wasn't a real serpent. But Moses or Aaron's actually was, and Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. I've often wondered how those magicians must have felt after it was over. They did their magic trick with their staff, and then they lost their staff because Aaron's staff swallowed them all up. And then Aaron's staff became his staff again. I've often wondered just what kind of a visual that had to be for Moses and for Aaron and for Pharaoh and all of his servants who were with him. But we notice in verse 13 that even though Aaron's staff was shown to be superior, it was shown to be the greater of the snakes, Pharaoh still didn't listen. Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, and he refused to listen to them. And again, notice he refused just as God said he would. And therefore, God sets up the scene. This sets up the scene for the next verse. God has given him a chance. God has given him his ability to deny him, to accept him, and do what God told him to do, let the people go, or refuse, and he's going to have to face the consequences. And again, this again to me tells me, knowing God and knowing how he is throughout the entirety of the Bible, that God is giving Pharaoh a choice here. If God just hardened Pharaoh's heart without a choice, and that makes God a pretty judgmental God, maybe a God that I don't know if I'd want to serve, because if God made Pharaoh's heart hard and then God did these punishments to him, it's almost like God didn't give him a chance to make a choice. But Pharaoh had a choice, as we see throughout the Bible. Pharaoh had the opportunity to obey God, but he refused to obey God. And because he refused to obey God, we see what happens next. In verse 15 or verse 14, we see the beginning of the plagues. The beginning of God showing Pharaoh and showing Egypt who he is. Notice verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, as he is going out into the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. And the fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. So notice what happens here. We'll talk about this, and we'll talk about the next step. God comes back and he tells Moses again, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He's refusing to listen. Now it's time to prove who we are. Now it's time to prove who I am and who you are and the message you have. And so what he says is you go out in the next morning and you meet Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is going to go out and survey the Nile. In Egypt, as we all know, the Nile was a very important function. The Nile was very prosperous for the Egyptian people. It's where they got all their drinking water. It's where they got their water for their crops. Got nearly all the water the nation depended upon come from the Nile. They would use that Nile to fish. They would use that Nile for traveling back and forth. The Nile was the heartbeat of Egypt, if you will. And Pharaoh is going out into the morning. And again, we don't really know why he's going out to the water. Maybe he's going out to survey it. Some people think he's going to survey it. Some people think he may be like the Pharaoh's daughter was talked about earlier in this book, was going out there to bathe. We really don't know. But Pharaoh is on his way out to the Nile for whatever reason. And Moses is told to be standing there by the water. And basically, you're going to stand by the water, God says. You're going to take this staff. Now, again, I want us to notice, and we're going to talk about this in nearly every plague, the importance of this staff. Because nearly every plague God does, it has something to do with this staff doing something in response to it. And God says, take this staff, and you're going to take this staff to meet him, and then you're going to hold it over the water, and we're going to do something. But God says first, verse 16, notice, the Lord, Yahweh, the name of God, the God of the Hebrews sent me to you. And here's Moses' warning. And this is a warning, not as much as a warning to change or let people go or he's going to do this, but this is a warning as Pharaoh, this is your consequences. Because you'll notice this is one of the times that some of the plagues, God will give Pharaoh the option to get out of it. He'll give Pharaoh the option of, okay, if you don't do this, then you can, if you don't act this way, or if you'll let my people go, I won't send this plague to you. That's what I was trying to say. But here he has no option like that. He comes straight to the Nile and he says, the Lord God sent me to you. This is coming from God. This is the God of the Hebrews. And he says, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. And he knows, he says, but so far, up to this point, you've not listened to me. Up to now, you've not listened. You've not responded. You've not obeyed. And he knows, verse 17, thus says the Lord. And again, notice the emphasis here in these two verses of the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. He wants Pharaoh to know this is not Moses, this is God. And notice what he says, you shall know that I'm the Lord. Again, knowing is not just knowing his name and knowing who he is, but knowing to recognize his true power, to recognize his true ability. And he says, you shall know the Lord. And again, behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water. I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. And Moses is told to strike that water, we're going to see in just a minute, and the water of the Nile turns to blood. Now, some have argued throughout time on whether or not this is real blood or fake blood, and really either way works. Some have said this may just be an algae or something that looks like blood. Possibly, it fits within this because the idea that it was like blood or was blood could leave the idea that it wasn't technically blood. But again, for those who believe in God and believe in his power, there's no reason to even question that God couldn't change pure water into pure blood. But notice what he says is going to happen. The water is going to turn into blood. And here's what's going to happen. This water, here's the key thing, is this water is going to become going to turn into something that's harmful. Notice the fish in the Nile are going to die. All the people who fished, all the people who depended on the fish to come from the Nile, they're going to be without food. They're going to be without that supply of water. And then not only that, the Nile is going to stink. Now, what's interesting about this is that everybody in Egypt, or majority of people in Egypt, they live within a couple miles of the Nile. That's where the majority of Egypt was centered because the Nile was so important. You had to live close to the Nile. Well, the Nile is going to turn into this bloody river that's going to stink. And then you're going to notice that the water is going to be such a thing. And this is what makes some people think that it may have been like blood, not technically blood, is because he says the Egyptians will go weary of drinking water from the Nile. Because it's described here as water, not blood. But again, it could be either way, and that's technicality. Either way, we're going to see a miracle by God. God's going to make the Nile to where it's going to be something that was a blessing, but now is a curse. And so God tells the Egyptians they're going to get weary of drinking the water from the Nile. And basically, this is what's going to happen. Now, notice what happens next. As soon as Moses tells Pharaoh, this is what's going to happen. Verse 19, God says, this is how it's going to go. Verse 19, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in the vessels of stone. So basically what God says, you're going to take out your staff, you're going to stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the water that comes from the Nile, and you're going to turn it all into blood. And notice the completeness of this, that over the rivers that feed into the Nile, they're all going to turn to blood. The canals, now the canals were irrigation canals they had dug to allow the Nile to give water throughout the land. That's going to turn to blood. The ponds, the reservoirs of water they had built in the ground that they had taken water from the Nile and filled it up, that's going to turn to blood. The pools of that water is going to turn to blood. The places they had this water collected, even the water. Now notice this last part. Even the water in the vessels of wood and vessels of stone. This is going to be. Some people think the vessels of wood are pitchers that they would have had in their houses, or they would have had a stone basin that they would have used for farming or for industry, whatever. The water is not even touching the Nile. It's the idea that it's going to become blood. And so this is what Moses and Aaron are going to do. And then again, notice verse 20. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. He lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank. So the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, this is an idea of an artist's interpretation of what this thing may have looked like, that idea of the Nile. This is a picture of the Nile in Egypt and the turning of it to blood. And this is the completeness of it. Now you notice again, going back to verse 20, Moses and Aaron again did exactly as God commanded. They did just what God told them to do. And then here, not only they did it inside of Pharaoh, they did it inside of his servants. And the idea of the servants here are not just his servants as his lower housekeepers and such. This is another way of describing his government officials. His servants are going to talk about his higher up officials in his government, or other ranking people. And we're going to see these people are going to later come to Pharaoh and beg Pharaoh to change his mind. But they all see this and they all know who is causing this trouble. And again, Aaron does as Moses was commanded. He lifts the staff up. He stuck the water in the Nile, and lift up staff and stuck it in the water, and all the water became blood. And then again, notice the Nile died. All the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the Nile. And again, there's blood throughout all the land. All the water that God had told them was going to turn into blood, turned into blood. And so therefore, the people of Israel, Egypt, were struck with this. Now, this is an interesting thing about these first 3 or 4 plagues, is we're going to see the people of Judah were not, or the people of Israel, were not exempt from these first ones. Later, there's going to be an exemption. We'll talk about that exemption. But for the first ones, they're going to be affected by this just as the Egyptians were. But we're going to see one last thing about God in the last few verses here before we finish for tonight. Because we're going to again see a copy of God, but we're going to see some compassion of God. You notice verse 22, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. Notice again, the magicians come. Pharaoh calls for his wise men to come, and they copy the miracle. They copy this. Now, they don't copy it on the same effect. Again, they probably take a container of water and make it into this blood, or make it into something. They would definitely something that looked like blood. They copied God's miracle, but not to the effect of God's miracle. But yet it was enough that Pharaoh's heart hardened. Pharaoh's heart remained hard and wouldn't bow and wouldn't give in. And again, he wouldn't listen to them. And again, we're told again, this is just like God said. God told him this was going to happen. And in verse 23, Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Pharaoh is so hardened, so cut off from this, that he just goes into his house to get away. And he didn't even take it to heart. It didn't even bother him. That's an interesting thing about this, is that Pharaoh didn't let this get to him. This shows you just how hard and how stubborn and how refusing Pharaoh was here, that he didn't even let this get into his mind at all. And he knows verse 24, and this is where I told you a very interesting point, because we see the compassion of God. There's compassion because God is striking Egypt with these plagues, but God is not striking them in such a way that he's going to kill them. No, you see, if God had struck the water in Egypt and all the water turned to blood everywhere and throughout Egypt, the Egyptians would have a big part of them would have died of dehydration. If all the water had turned to blood and it was undrinkable, then the people would have been in trouble. They would have thirsted to death. Even the Israelites would have done that. But instead, God spared some water. Where did he spare it? He spared it in the underground wells. Because notice what happens in verse 24. The Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink. They basically dug wells. They found these water reservoirs that were not harmed by the miracle, and they dug wells. Well, that leads us to ask the question, well, was God not all powerful enough to change all the water there? Yes, he was. Did God just miss that water? No, he didn't miss it. God knew where the water was. So why didn't God change that? Well, God has sympathy. Even though Pharaoh wouldn't listen to him, even though the Egyptians refused to acknowledge him, he didn't want to kill them. He didn't want to destroy them all without a hope, without a chance. And that's a very important thing about God in this passage and other passages, especially in these plagues, is that God provided Egypt with a way to survive, to make it through after these plagues. God didn't just annihilate the people and they were no longer a nation. He's going to completely destroy them. He left them a nation behind. Now, God proved a point. God made it very inconvenient to make the point of who he was. But God was going to show them who he was. He left them the alternative. He left them the way to go to the wells to find water. Now, another thing about this, and we'll look at the last verse, one of the other things about the Nile is that some historians have said that the Nile was viewed as a god by the Egyptians, because the Nile was able to provide them with the water and provide them with the sustenance they needed to grow their plants and to live their day-to-day life, that they made the Nile a god. And if that's the case, and that's what most people say it is, what you see here, God destroying the Nile like he did, shows that he's a greater God than the God of the Nile. He's a greater God than that God they were serving. And then the last verse, chapter 7, tells us that 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. What this verse is typically taken to mean is that for 7 straight days, for a week, the Nile was blood. And then most likely after those 7 days, it returned. But God left this for a week, a whole week, to show and prove who he was. Now, this leads us to another interesting point about these plagues, is we're going to see that there's some implication, there's some time in between these plagues. It's not like day one, God turned the water to blood and then sent the frogs and so forth and so on as we go through. It's just bam, 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 the either consecutive days or even the same day, as some people read it. No, there's some space. God is allowing Pharaoh and his people time to see who he is, to understand this is not just a magic trick that these men did to maybe look like for a second, but something that had lasting effects, that would last beyond their time. And therefore, we see what happens when the waters turn to blood. And that brings us to the end of our lesson tonight. This brings us to the end of Exodus chapter 7. Next week, we'll look at Exodus 8. Exodus 8 is going to talk about the next 3 plagues, what God does and what Pharaoh does. We're going to start to see some interesting things. Is that Pharaoh is going to start to, and may not be the next few plagues, but eventually Pharaoh is going to start to bargain with God. He's going to start bargaining with Moses. What we're going to see is we're going to see the plagues take place in the book of Exodus, from Exodus chapter 7 to Exodus chapter 13. That's how the plagues are spread out along the next few chapters. And we're going to see these plagues and talk about them, see what they would have done to the people, how effective they were, and what it taught them. But for tonight, we're looking at this idea of God turning the water to blood. What God does here is God begins to show Moses and show Aaron and show Israel and show Egypt who he really is. That he's not just a God of words. He's not just a God who says good things, who has good thoughts or wants to do good things. But he is a God of action. He is a God who gives people everywhere a chance to repent, a chance to make things right. But when they don't, and the time comes, he's going to act. He's going to step forward and he's going to take action. And that's what we see here with Pharaoh. God says it's time to take action. It's time to prove to Pharaoh who I really am, and to prove to the Egyptians who I really am. And in effect, it's not only going to prove to the Egyptians who God is, it's also going to prove to the Israelites who God is, that he is the true God, not a God of a land, not a God of an area, but the God of the world, the God of all things. And that's the same lesson we can learn. We learn the same thing, that we have a God who's able to do all things, a God who wants us to come to him, to know him. He wants to save us. But if we don't obey him, we don't listen to him, there are going to be consequences. There's going to be problems in life. There's going to be difficulties in life to come. But for tonight, I appreciate you joining us. Appreciate you being here. For those of you online, we appreciate you joining us. We're about to end our live for Facebook and YouTube. Remember, our next service is Sunday morning. We'll meet at 10 a.m. That will be, again, live on Facebook and YouTube as always. But for now, we hope everyone is having a good week and a good time. Also, remember this Saturday, we set the clocks back. So remember to change your clocks on Saturday before we do it. Okay, in a minute. But anyway, I just said I've got help wanting to sell some people by. But we're going to sign off of our YouTube video. Again, appreciate everyone being here. And we hope to see you all Sunday or see you all next week.